So Dr. Jason Sargent is an information systems academic who spent over 20 years bringing people and technology together for a better world. Jason's teaching and research nexus is on the deployment of technology for social impact, particularly for humanitarian crises and in support of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Welcome, Jason, and I might hand straight over to you.
Okay, thank you, Robo. Thank you, Katina. Hello, everybody from ISTAS, wherever you are around the world, near and far. So my talk is more of a conversation. So I'll quickly get into it, and then I'll unpack the title as we get into the next couple of slides. So a lot of you would hopefully be aware around Atticus Finch, the name, and the beloved character from To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee's seminal work. And Atticus Finch often comes up as one of the most respected characters in literature and film, in surveys. And it's based around the characteristics of being an elder, being a good person. So the question's often asked, why is he so good? And these sort of things come out. So the wisdom and a calmness. And those who've read the book and watched the film in particular with the American actor Gregory Peck would know how he acts, and his tone is very deliberate, and he's looked upon, and he's really the backbone of the county and the town that he lives in, and a person who others would turn to in their moment of crisis. And then Society 5.0 is another concept that I'm going to walk through. And so I've taken the Japanese Cabinet Office definition. There's a few of them, but I like the idea of this moving from 4.0, the automation and machine to machine, and bringing back this human-centered society in the focus. So not stopping economic development, but having things in balance, which a couple of the presenters have already talked about. So they're two of the concepts. And then I'm using the theory, I guess, from Bazan, Olive Weaver, and Dewald as well, where securitization for me is really about the international relations, and it's in a political context. And these three elements turn up: the referent objects, the securitizing actors, and the extreme measures that eventuate come out of those situations. So securitization generally, it's, for me, in my mind, it's a transformation that occurs. And I'm going to give you an example on the next slide of maybe a historical one in a current day context. But it's as you voice, so the voice activity, something happens in the mind of the audience. And I picked up on a point that Philip made about how it's perceived, perhaps, what is said by the actors, the audience in particular as well. So the transformation happens when something that's maybe not exceptional, but it's taken out of the ordinary and put into this existential threat, or becomes a problem in the mind of the audience, the way it's said, who says it, those sort of things. And so the language is very important here when they talk through security and this existential threat. So theory again from Kirk and MacDonald. So two examples here. First one's Australian-based, the second one's global. So on the right, we can see two images. The first one is Captain Arne Rinnen, and he was the captain of the MV Tampa. Tampa was a roll-on, roll-off, a ro-ro cargo ship. And if you just Google up the Tampa incident or the Pacific Solution or Arne Rinnen himself, you get to the voice activity where it was spoken by the present, at the time, 2001, the Australian Prime Minister, John Howard. And it was all part of an election campaign as well, but strongly and forcefully telling everybody that we decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. It wasn't about air arrivals, it was about the asylum seeker boats that were coming in, and the timing, 2001, we were, as a country, at war with terror, and we still are. And so this sort of comes into this timeline, I think, that Philip mentioned as well. It's an ongoing war with terror. But the existential threat through securitization and what was voiced by the Prime Minister was, in my mind, this idea that asylum seekers were coming from Afghanistan. Afghanistan was home to Al-Qaeda, we're at war with terrorism, so therefore the asylum seekers were terrorists. And again, as part of the impending election campaign. So the existential threat became that the asylum seekers are terrorists, and how could we let them come into the country? Nothing about the technology that could be used in the biometrics identification processes to assist the UNHCR. None of that, just the scare campaign as part of the securitization. And if we again look at the time, 2001, we didn't really have a lot of social media platforms. We took our news from the TV, which would come on at 6 o'clock, and the commercial stations and the national broadcasters. But there was a clear and present danger, according to the Prime Minister, and it was a way to put a scare campaign through. Present day, we can name any of the pandemic items around, particularly the surveillance, the lack of privacy, the perceived need to do this because it was a global pandemic, using technology in all sorts of ways through surveillance. Myself, from Melbourne, Australia, we were actually not allowed to travel more than 5 kilometres from home. And so there was a little bit of geolocation technology used, number plate reading on vehicles and things like this. And the photo on the right is from Tunisia, I think, or maybe Algiers, in Algeria, where we've got the 4.0, the technology, the robots checking for identification. Now, these would be extraordinary instances without the global pandemic. And the threat was always that we would not get our privacy back once these existential threats had existed long enough in our minds and were perhaps justified by those, the referent, the ones who were doing it, giving the power, enacting the power to do this onto the citizens. And you're probably all familiar with the QR codes, the check-in apps, all of those things. So just 2 examples, and other present day ones we could add in Cambridge Analytica, we could have the data breaches, privacy tracking on the phones, and I could go on and on. But this gets me into the idea of who do we trust now? Who can we rely on? But specifically, who can come in almost as an intermediary once the voicing activity has happened? We shouldn't just be convinced that the existential threat is real. We need a moderating voice, I feel, and I'm not sure who that person or who that entity can be, because trust is fraying. And so maybe trust anchors are one solution, widely recognised authorities, perhaps individuals, perhaps organisations, and their endorsement or their, hey, everybody, let's just take a step back, let's take a breath and look through this situation first. Let's bring some considered, centred approach to this. Do they actually exist, and can they exist now in the present tech world that we're in? So the voice of reason, I would call them. Those who can get us to act sensibly. But who do we trust? Who engenders that trust in us? So then I got to thinking, is it the institutions? Is it the community groups, or perhaps individuals? Who should be our trust anchors? So IEEE, SSIT pops up. I would think maybe in Australia, the Australian Computer Society could play that role. Globally, I'd go through Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web Foundation and the Internet Society, for example. Could be typical organisations that we would put our trust in and perhaps could be the trust anchors. But I didn't see a lot of broadcast perspectives, opinions, voices of reason coming out from those organisations. There were certainly researchers publishing about the dangers and the perceptions of we may not get our privacy back and things like that, but generally not standing up on the pedestal saying, hey, wait a minute, let's work this through. And again, maybe the timelines, the urgency in particular with the global pandemic was one of those reasons why. So this is leading on now to the idea of elders. And I'll get to a class activity, which I've been running for about the last 3 semesters in a moment. But on the next slide, I do have a couple of images and some names of some Aboriginal elders who've passed. And as is custom here in Australia, just to give a warning that those images and names are coming up. So for me, the Aboriginal context of elders is a useful starting point, and then I'll broaden out into the probably a larger set of characteristics of these people or these entities that would be considered elders. What do they possess? What are their unique characteristics? So Aboriginal elders, there's a recognition, they are a custodian of knowledge and law, and this has been passed down through generations. We've got one of the oldest living continuing cultures in the world through the Aboriginal communities in Australia. There's an agreement or a permission has been granted for the elders in the Aboriginal community to pass along the knowledge and their beliefs. And perhaps age alone is not necessarily the recognised or unique characteristic, but certainly most of the names that pop up into your mind are people who are getting on in age or elderly. Not unique to Aboriginal culture, but people traditionally refer to elders as an auntie or an uncle. And I certainly do that in my work in India and my family in Vietnam. So that's not a specific characteristic to the Aboriginal way of discussing or describing an elder. But here's a couple of people who I think unanimously in Australia we would consider as Aboriginal elders. Just that they happen to be awesome human beings is probably part and parcel of it. But the names you can see there all have passed on, and the 2 gentlemen have passed on this year. So I'd highly recommend, can't recommend enough, just Google the names and look at the wonderful, beautiful love story film about the couple you can see in the middle. A 2022 film that was just released. So if we go more broadly around the elders, and I'm in search of the elders, I'm quite clear about that. I wear it on my sleeve. I'm on the search. And maybe this is on the way to some sort of writing the book of who are these elders, in search of the elders. Certainly trusted and respected. So perhaps Nelson Mandela and Helen Clark, and I'll get to Yanis Barakis in a moment. Reputation, so it's a lived experience. They've done the hard yards, not just talk, but walk. I would disagree that age is a defining characteristic, and I'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to suggest a couple of people who I'd consider elders, and some of them are not elderly in age. Lived experience, again, goes hand in hand with reputation. And these are translators across cultures, local, global. They can easily translate the situation. And that's why I think they're a very good fit for a mediator to come in. So if something happens, the securitization, the activity of the speech, I would have quite easily listened to what Mandela was telling me to step in as the mediator. Helen Clark's still with us. Yanis has passed on as well. Consistent in their opinion. So not back and forward, not changing. And another thing which I think makes them mediators is it's almost an instinctive tone that they talk in and the way they deliberately talk. It's not an angry tone. It's not a a sarcastic or a condescending tone. It's something I think that's intuitive to all of these three people that you see. Now, if you worked in the humanitarian domain or researched in the domain from anywhere from about the mid-1990s through to 2015 when we lost Giannis, he was our eyes. He was the one we trusted. He was a Reuters photographer, went into all the war zones, all the humanitarian crises. And you can just look at his wonderful photos and you go, okay, I didn't know that person took that. But they're so memorable and pack a lot of power. So we were fortunate, for those of us who worked or researched and went into the field, to be able to look through the eyes and the lens that Giannis gave us. And I would unreservedly have trusted him, but that was 2015 that he passed away. And now we're faced with things like deep fakes, misinformation and intentional campaigns around misinformation, image manipulation. And I can't be sure, and I tell my students all the time, your future lived experience, the complexity in your problem is not just data, but having the truth in that data, in that person, on that screen, that image, that video that's talking to you. A lot has changed since 2015, since we lost Giannis. So the mediators, again, trust, a centralism, that they're not on one side or the other, instinctively the appropriate tone that they use. General elders, I'm in search of our tech elders. And so I've been running this thought exercise for my undergrads and my postgrads. They're all enrolled in STEM type degrees, some, as I said, masters, some final year, final semester undergrad students. So I would generally base the question around, or the activity in class, when faced with this crisis, professional or personal, the uncertainty, the dilemmas, who do you turn to? Who are your elders? And then who are your tech elders? It's a little bit harder for them to answer the question in red. I'm trying to get the names to come across of the younger generation. And it's quite hard for them to give me an answer. So common answers after 30 seconds or 60 seconds of silence would be things like this. Often they don't say to me, a parent, they'll say, is it a parent? So they're almost asking for me to agree with them. Very few will give a response, and then occasionally we'll get Bill Gates as an elder in tech. And a lot of the time, cannot think of one, is the response. Here's the most chilling response that I've had. So imagine bright young minds, third year, final semester undergrads, STEM students, and master students who would say their elders is Google. Still blows my mind when I think of it. So who are our tech elders? Are they localized? Are they geographically located? Do they exist by another name? Do we simply call them something else, our mentor or the guru grasshopper? Why do we not know our elders? Why do our about to be public interest technologist graduates, our STEM leaders of the future, not know who our elders are? Is it perhaps because they and we've never been asked? Now, I've only been in a couple of sessions today, and there's a lot of presenters here who would probably be in my list, but I've deliberately not put anybody today or in the ISTAS into this list. I would suggest these four names as a starting point. Solo, fintech, startup, AI, definitely not elder by age, but translational, yes. considered fantastic communicator, young guy. And I go, thank goodness we've got people like Solo. Susan Tedrick, who I've never met physically, but about 2 or 3 years ago in an ISTAS conference, she presented what I would consider the masterclass on professional issues in IT. Now, she's either Microsoft, she was working, I think, at IBM at the time. Again, you'll probably have to Google some of these names. Kathy Treadaway, who I've only got to get to know this year, and the work around the hug by Laugh, so the low tech, and giving us the framework that had love in the middle. And again, if you've got a large cohort of undergrad students, mostly male, 23 to say 30 years old, and I said to them, imagine you guys putting that up on the screen at a conference of, testosterone-filled audience. How do you think that's going to go down? And they laugh and they think, there's no way we would put that up there. Love, are you kidding? And I'd say to them, just give yourself 10 years and you'll realize how wrong you were and how right Kathy Treadaway is. And Ted Okada, who I haven't met personally, but he's been on my radar. Kat, if you're still listening in, I guess this goes back to 2000 and maybe 2001 with his work at Groove Networks. And he's now the Chief Technology Officer at FEMA. So they're just 4 that I sort of thought of. It didn't take me very long, but there are so many others that I've mentioned in previous talks. And so we've got a Menti code there, and when the recording goes out, I guess we'll get more names brought into the word cloud. But I might just sort of bring it to a close. I won't show you the dynamic word cloud. But I think, again, if I've got students about to go out the door, have I done my best to plant those seeds, knowing that I'm not going to get a result at the moment. I just hope I'm putting that seed into the mind. And if I can't, sort of do it now, the Chinese proverb, the best time to plant the idea into the minds, it was many, many years ago. That hasn't happened for my students. So the second best time is now, or in my final lecture of the semester. And the little Mandela, all of the elders, we used to be little once. So again, another reason why I think this is important to get the next generation thinking around who are the elders? Who do we go to in that time of crisis? Who in particular can mediate us through the securitization? Because certainly a key takeaway of all the presenters is securitization is here to stay. How do we get through this? Remove some of the roadblocks. So Elias, how can a mediator, how can an elder be able to maybe just move one of those roadblocks? And another name that I often use and refer to is not an IT person per se, but Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's got a great quote that if you do 2 things each day, learn a bit of knowledge and ease the suffering of someone else, you'd be surprised how far that will take you. And I think that's a good sort of model to follow as well. Okay, I think I might just leave it there. Give us a bit of time for some Q&A.